Okay, I'm going to start again because we don't have that much time. Looking at a slightly later period in time, but it sort of fits in because we've just been talking about art in a authoritarian regime, the Nazi art, and we've talked before about art in the Soviet Union, and we're broadly talking about art that has some relationship to responding to the modern conditions. So I'll just say a little bit about art in the People's Republic of China, the Maoist years particularly, because I think it will sort of fit into this story. And I think it's important to introduce some kind of cultural diversity into the course, since we're talking mostly about art in Europe in this course. It's good to just jump to a completely different civilizational context to find a way to relativize that, to decenter that. Looking at the period of the 1930s, to a lot of art of that time wasn't concerned with addressing issues of society, but there was a tendency within it that was, particularly once we start to see issues of internal conflict within China itself, particularly with the rise of the Japanese territorial threat within China. And prominent in that tendency was that of the woodblock artists, the woodcut artists, who were identified more with a left-wing position. I mean, maybe woodcut as a medium, it's something because it can be mass reproduced more easily. It fits in just on that level with an art that wants to be addressed to a wider audience. And there's some kind of connection into the art we've been looking at, because stylistically there's quite a strong influence of expressionist woodcut art. What we're looking at here is a work by Li Hua, who's one of the prominent figures of the woodcut movement, even becoming a cultural official in later Maoist years. But this is the sort of work he produced in the 1930s. The turbid waters engulf a miserable soul. The sense of turmoil and suffering of the time is summed up. More explicitly nationalistic is this one, Raw China, around 1935, which is giving you the sense of an individual figure, but an individual figure that sort of sums up the state of the nation, is personifies the nation, both in terms of its bondage, the limitations, but also in the sense of the hand reaching out to free itself, to reaching out for a knife, which is then going to lead to the ropes being cut. So there's some element of hope, not just some negativity, even though if negativity is the dominant tone, there is a kind of an optimism towards the future, even if that optimism involves some act of a kind of quasi-violent act of cutting. But it's expressionistic in the sense of relying on raw emotion, a sort of screaming, crying figure, and the idea that crying out is a good thing. It's actually based or inspired by a drama written by a Russian writer, which had the same title, Raw China. So there's some sort of links in with Russian leftist culture. very simplified, which the medium woodcut allows simplification. So you see, it's a modernist strategy, but a modernist strategy in the service of social issues, socio-political issues, and a desire to transform society. A key figure in the woodblock movement was the great writer Lu Xun, who helped bring examples of Western woodcut art to the attention of mostly a young generation of artists. So this is a much, this is a sort of representation of what he was doing in that early period. Li Hua himself, in the era of the People's Republic, changes his style greatly. So he's just a good example to show how leftist art transforms almost totally in the new society once it's established. So this is 1959, Conquering the Yellow River. So all that kind of emotive dimension of raw China is gone. The only emotions are kind of more sort of positive emotions that are allowed into art, not the sense of negativity. And of course, modernity cannot have any discontents in the art of the new society, because it's meant to be a perfect society anyway. Where is the enemy then? Well, the enemy then maybe is nature. So here you're fighting against nature. You're conquering nature, conquering the Yellow River specifically. And that's a sort of, that rhetoric of conquering nature is sort of prevalent in art of the People's Republic. And you see that the title of the work is actually written on the dam, some kind of slogan there. And the task is a collective task rather than an individual task. Here we have a kind of sort of individual representing the nation, which is sort of ambiguous, but here it's clearly no one individual. It's all collective effort that will transform nature, build physically a new society and its infrastructure. So not telling us of anything that may be wrong in the new society, but just to present a positive image of progress, or the expressive dimension reduced to a realism, and realism used because it's a pliant tool, not because of any truth value that it has. Actually, so much of the art in the new society seemed to have very little critical dimension to it. That wasn't its role, and was just a pliant servant of political purposes. But what I'm showing you mostly here will be some examples of ink painting, and that's one of the distinctive features of Chinese art, that inner diversity, that inner hybridity between ink painting and oil painting. Oil painters generally seem to find little distance from the values of the state in the new society, but ink painters, although sometimes they ran into problems, and sometimes ink painting as a mode was problematic, but nevertheless there's something about ink painting that it retained qualities of personal expression and individuality. It's almost intrinsic to the medium is personal expression, and so that some interesting things happen in the art of a time where art was really meant to be just a tool and not an end in its own right. Guanshan Yue, Oil City in the South, 1972. So we're talking about art from the Cultural Revolution era, when the constraints were pretty much at their highest. The Guanshan Yue is working in the idiom borrowed from the Lingnan, he's part of the Lingnan school, and Lingnan school had tried to use ink painting, already adapted ink painting to the task of representing the modern world, and were, pro-revolutionary in their own time. Perhaps rather more straight lines than one is used to in the heritage of Chinese ink painting, bringing with this imagery of the modern industrialization and railway lines transporting in the foreground. Something sort of a curious sort of remnant of those earlier times, the steam from the train or produced by the industrial production mimic the clouds of a kind of pre-modern landscape painting, and the kind of mode of constructing a landscape that you would have there, even if other ways there is a departure from it. I think we're meant to read it as kind of all the kind of geometry of it all as kind of modern in a way, but there has to be some reference back to the past, and that's a slightly awkward in its association. Li Keran, this is his Yi He Yuan of 1954. In the early years of the People's Republic, he's talking a lot about the importance of a kind of realism in the ink painting tradition. But then a little bit later, 1959, he comes to attack a kind of slavish realism and talks about the importance of having a creative conception too. The national landscape is very much the subject. Even from the early part of the century, artists were sort of striving towards how do you find a way to create a national art. It's something new. You had to kind of, there was no rules about how to make a national art. But after 1949, you had to make a national art. It was a kind of a requirement that you make a national art. So representing the national landscape and sometimes particular sites of revolutionary significance, that becomes one way in which you can do it. 10,000 Crimson Hills, 1964. So just through the use of red colour, one way that Li Keran imbues the landscape painting with state ideology. Other artists can do it in a much more simple way. Just to you just could be painting a landscape, but you have a few figures with red flags in the foreground, tiny figures with red flags in the foreground. That could be enough sometimes to make your work sort of seem to fit into the new society. Here he's illustrating lines from a Mao poem, and that's one of the common strategies used to try and produce an ink painting that is fitting to the new society. The question sort of comes up to what extent artists are kind of really enthusiastically endorsing the new values, or to what extent they are trying to find ways to carry on doing what they're doing and protectively using certain strategies to enable them to do so. There's works of this period and during the Cultural Revolution period particularly are very often rather stiff, and Li Keran had a lot of trouble during the Cultural Revolution, even losing his personal freedom as other artists did. But in the period after that, then he produces some of his better work. So you can see a sort of kind of continuity through in his practice to some extent, despite all the interruptions. So this is River in Mist and Evening Light, 1987. A lot of the works of this time, very large-scale works, because they're to be put in public places, whereas art, the pre-modern period, is for private consumption amongst the elite a lot of the time. Here it's now the role of art is to play a public role, and so a greater scale comes in, and a certain kind of monumentality of treatment, again very much involved with the national landscape. Sometimes very heavy, kind of almost dramatic kind of use of black. And I would want to say it's not just something from the ink painting tradition. He's looked at the work of Rembrandt. A lot of travelling was important for artists. Artists were sent or given opportunities to travel around the country to explore the national landscape, to report back on it in their art. But certain artists also had the chance to travel outside of the country. For oil painters, it might be your training in Russia or something like that. But for Licoran, he travelled to Eastern Germany, and he could see Rembrandt's work. I think there's something of Rembrandt's light effects even coming into his practice. Perhaps more successful sometimes are the small album leaves and other smaller works he produces with motifs like this, The Herd Boy and Cow, 1980, where he's not engaging in that monumental treatment, and then therefore a little sort of personal spontaneity can be part of it all. Bauscher, showing you one of his works from before the revolution, 1945, landscape inspired by a poem of Churtau. Churtau was very important stylistic influence on him. The work is nearly abstract, just two figures at the bottom, but apart from that, really very abstracted treatment of the landscape. You're very aware of the brushwork. Of course, these are all characteristics that had to be won by Western modernism, the expressive touch valued for itself, but it's there already in the Chinese brushwork tradition. It doesn't have to be started from zero, because there never was that obsession with illusionistic realism in China. So modernism in Chinese brushwork tends to be a sort of exaggeration or exacerbation of existing traits rather than a complete overthrow of the past. The past is, that's what Churtau is allowed to be there in the 1940s work. It's, you don't have to break with the past. In fact, he's one of the artists you can use to overcome more traditional modes within the ink painting tradition. When you, like many 20th century artists, Bauscher helped rediscover Churtau's importance. Even after the revolution, though he's having to represent, the progress of the economy and the infrastructural building, nevertheless, I think there is a sort of spontaneity and a personal touch there. Like I said at the beginning, it's somehow innate to the medium that you have a kind of personal quality. And that enables, I think, the ink painters to retain something of interest in their work that the oil painters don't necessarily keep. Very famous, this very big work that he did with Guanshan Yue, such as The Beauty of Our Mountains and Streams, for the Great Hall of the People, 1959. I'm sorry, it's only from an illustration in a book, but in working on such a large scale, all that personal touch is lost, of course. There's a stiffness to the whole thing. Again, it's Mao's poetry to be represented. But other works, even in terms of meaning, not just in terms of the artist's brushwork, there may be something personal. This is Chu Yuan. He painted images of Chu Yuan from different time periods. He started with this theme during the late Republican period when he was in Sichuan province during the war, but he continues with it into the People's Republic. Now, maybe during the Republican era, he's making him a kind of symbol of national resistance, but then why is he carrying on with the same theme after the revolution when everything is supposed to be optimistic? It's a theme of someone about to commit suicide as a heroic act of resistance, if you like. It's about self-sacrifice. But why does the same theme stay after the revolution? It's a little hard to understand, and it gives to the work some potential slightly subversive range of connotations. Hard to say how consciously the artist is exploring those, but they're sort of there in a way. Other artists who treat Chu Yuan as a subject tend not to show him at this moment where he's about to jump into the river. And what he did was, as people will know the story, he drowned himself by gathering stones that would weigh him down. And Fu Baoshi's name, Bao Shi, is partly taken from that relationship to Chu Yuan. It's also about cherishing Shi Tao. So he's got a double kind of reference to figures in the past. Anyway, so even at the level of meaning, something complicated going on that's not quite subservient to state ideology, I would say. Shirlu, fighting in northern Shanxi, 1959. Well, attempt to use ink painting and landscape modes to represent revolutionary history, a moment in revolutionary history with Mao gazing out over the mountain. So, and of course red again used to signify a communist dawn. But within a few years, Shirlu is doing something like this, the Yellow River Gorges of around 1972. So it's Cultural Revolution era, but he's producing a kind of modernist art. And leads him to trouble and ends his life in a kind of descent into madness. There's a big price to pay, which there never was for Fu Baoshi, because he didn't live through to the Cultural Revolution era, never faced this kind of challenge. This transformation to his late work is inspired partly by encounter with the late Qing artist Xu Gu, whose work he really admired when he first got to see it. I mean, this is so different, I think, this degree of individuality in ink painting to what we see when we look at oil. Here's just one or two examples. Liu Chunhua's Shema Mao going to An Yuan. This is around 1967. And the artist was really just a student still when the work was produced, but the work got endorsed by Jiang Qing, the cultural leader of the time, and as a result it was reproduced in lithographic form, color lithographic form, in a totally massive way, maybe 900 million copies, something like that, a massively vast distribution for an image. So it's a good example just of how history is distorted. I mean, the image has a particular function, which is to try and prove the importance of Mao's role in the leading the miners' strike in Anyuan in 1922, and to counteract Liu Shaoqi's role in that as part of an internal party struggle. So it's not about objective, critically informed, evidence-based history. It's about internal party struggle. So no matter how hard you're trying as an artist to do what you're told, the party struggle can move on, and next couple of years later, a couple of years before, you might have been asked to talk about Liu Shaoqi's role. Now you're asking to talk about Mao's role. You can't possibly get it right. You're always going to be wrong-footed by the next shift in internal party struggle. So however a good boy you are, things will not necessarily work out well for you. So, this is the Cultural Revolution era, is particularly where things are about cult imagery, which is actually a bizarre thing in a way for a communist society, but it happened in Russia with Stalin as well. Dong Xiwen, celebrating the founding of the PRC. Well, here's 1952 to 3 is the date of the work, but there are revisions at later date. Here the actual work itself has to change because some people have to disappear from history who were present. They can't be allowed to continue to be present as shifting, priorities. So the usefulness of realism to propaganda, because it has that sense of truthfulness about it. It's a realist mode that could be traced back to, just artists like David, but whereas an artist like David is trying to tell you about some complex moral dilemma or something like that, on which there are more than one sides. Here there is no two sides. There's just one way of looking at an event, which is treated as without internal ambiguity. Chen Yining, Chairman Mao inspects the village in Guangdong. I thought I could compare this to Gros, Napoleon Bonaparte visiting the plague victims in Jaffa, 1804. The powerful, charismatic political leader. His very presence can transform, even seems to be able to heal the sick or something like that. It's almost like a kind of work of religious art, and it's almost that kind of context we're getting with and what actually happened in Jaffa is neither here nor there. We presumably not this actually. A sort of interesting figure for talking about the transformations at the end of the Maoist period is Chen Yifei, and he starts off producing these works which sort of romanticizing realism of the Maoist world, embodying its ideologies. But a few years later, he's producing something like this. It's a similar style, a kind of meretricious realism, but only the ideology has shifted 180 degrees. So now it's kind of a sort of capitalist realism instead of a socialist realism. And instead of telling the stories of the Maoist years, it's telling a sort of fake history of earlier times, of a sort of almost as if it's almost as if you could recognize the actresses. Oh, there's Gung Li or something like that. You know, there's sort of got that sense of being a costume drama approach to the past, mediated via cinema or something like that. He actually had quite a bit of skill as a painter, and sometimes you see that coming through when he just does something unideological, unloaded. But he sort of went from serving one master to serving another master, the marketplace. And one of the first Chinese artists to make very large sums of money in the international marketplace. Well, this is really another story we don't have that much time to tell because it's getting towards a very different time period, but this is the beginnings of unofficial art, the Stars group, Wang Keping's Idol, one of the first works to which you could say is sort of engaging with Mao's status to produce an image which kind of represents him but deconstructed somehow, dethroning an idol. Bo Zhongli's father, 1980, is doing something similar but in a less overt or confrontational way. It's that partly the scale of the work would have been considered challenging. It's a very large work, a close-up of a face, such characteristics would only have been common for portraits of Mao at that time, Mao as the father of the nation. But here is a painting called Father, which just shows any old peasant as father. So that's already kind of challenging and slightly shocking in a way, but also the way in which he's treated with as someone subjected to injury, or even just his open-mouthed gaze is slightly ambiguous. It's so different from the fixed smiles of Cultural Revolution era images anyway. And he was forced by the chairman of the Sichuan Artists Association to add this pen behind the ear to indicate literacy, therefore to introduce some notion of progress. But that signifier is sort of detached on its own. There's nothing else in the painting that kind of indicates progress in the new society or a sense of moving forward. It sort of makes that sort of inauthentic almost. And yet it still has the strategy of realism, you know, which people would have been used to seeing through those. Yes, it's a strategy that has been used to tell untruths basically about the nature of society. Artists at the beginning of the post-Maoist period, rather than abandoning realism, what they do, Luo Zhongli is a very good example, is intensify realism. You know, take it ratchet it up one stage further. So it's a kind of hyper-realistic, close-up quality, almost cinematic. He'd seen in reproduction the work of an American photorealist artist, Chuck Close, who did these close-up portraits of faces. And that's one stylistic influence. But Chuck Close's photorealism. Photorealism is about making handmade images of a machine-made, mass-reproduced photographic images. But in this case, it functions more as a kind of intensification of realism, taking it, making realism even more unsettlingly real. It's not like speaking the official language, but speaking it more distinctly somehow, rather than abandoning it. Of course, there were other artists who did try to abandon it, like this is Ai Weiwei, untitled work from 1986, is kind of playing around with Bao's image, one of the very first to do so. And then into the 1990s, you see Yu Han, double image, 1992, this is the kind of work that could not have been shown in mainland China itself. First had its public showings in Hong Kong when it was towards the middle of that decade. It's referring, I suppose, to obviously it's Mao's image as seen in the frontispiece of the Little Red Book, one of the most mass reproduced images of human history, actually. But it's the way it's painted, it's a handmade representation of a printed image, but a misprinted image, slightly lacking in registration in the printing. So there's something, so the connotation is there's some mistake here, something's wrong here, something's not quite right. As well as talking about the process of propagation of images through which they gain their propaganda power, deconstructing that process. Well, so many artists like to have this early 1990s period, like to play with Mao's images. So Liu Wei is doing so and putting a sort of generational dimension into it. His work is titled The New Generation. The new generation doesn't seem to have progressed or anything. The faces look slightly dumb and it's a little bit like some of the figures that come across of children in films of that time. There's a famous film, Yellow Earth, where there's a child who doesn't speak for most of the film, or the Zhang Yimou film, Judo. There's a kind of similar kind of problematic child. Staying just with this one theme of artists sort of playing with Cultural Revolution era imagery, Wang Guangyi. I'm sorry, it's a very washed out slide, but this actual work, I think, is in the SIG collection on display at the moment in Artistry in Quarry Bay. But this is a very poor slide because it was taken at the time of the great 1989 exhibition in Beijing. Well, it's Mao again, but Mao caged or analysed, cut up, sliced up. That's the kind of association. Or again, it's about the image of propagating. Mao as an image that was much propagated. To blow up an image of Mao to a large scale, you had to have a source image, and you'd probably, as a painter, you'd grid it up like this, and then you transfer the grid to the appropriate scale and copy it section by section. That's a standard artistic strategy for making something larger. And he went on to produce a lot of images that juxtapose Cultural Revolution era propaganda with the new propaganda of the capitalist society, such as this work, the Great Criticism Series is the series title, Great Criticism Series, McDonald's, 1992. And in a way, it's also another image like the Liu Wei one, which talks to the absence of progress. We're moving from one propaganda to another. It isn't somehow, we moved away from that bad stuff and now we are free or something like that. It's just, that was the old propaganda. This is the new one, and actually the two rhetorics start to look rather similar. And I think it also, when he painted this work in 1992, it was a very interesting moment in mainland Chinese visual culture where the old slogans of the Maoist era were still visible across the cityscape. They hadn't been necessarily eliminated, but the new slogans of international advertising were also penetrating the cityscape. So you get two kind of incompatible rhetorics, one clashing right next to the other in a strange way. So nowadays he's still producing these kind of works, it seems, but that moment has gone. But when he first did it in 1992, I think it does successfully specify a certain moment. You know, that was the year of the first McDonald's branch in China. You know, so it's actually something to do with present day experience. That branch at the bottom of Wanfujing, which now has disappeared because there's a Li Ka-shing has a shopping mall there. Okay, that was very rushed, but I just want to introduce a slightly cross-cultural perspective. And then next week we will come back to look at Dada.